Hey everyone, Sky here to discuss Lady in the Water, starring Paul Giamatti, Bryce Dallas Howard, Jeffrey Wright, Bob Balaban, and Sarita Choudhury, and directed by M. Night Shyamalan. Now, I gotta confess, I have seen this movie before in movie theaters, and I want to tell you about this situation that I had two ladies sitting next to me. I'll talk about it when I get into this. So, will I like it as much as I did back then? We'll see. Let's get into it. I like the drawings of what we'll get throughout this movie about a lady in the water who goes in the world of the current events of this movie to wait for the eagles. And when they do go out there, there's some wolf-looking thing that'll attack her. And I like the drawings, but I was getting confused about how the whole thing works. And I'm thinking, show, don't tell. And they're telling us the plot of this movie, like, straight up, and that was a real problem from the get-go. In an apartment where he works at and lives at Cleveland Heap, played by Paul Giamatti from this particular movie, for example. And I'm thinking to myself, what is he doing in this movie? This whole movie is at one set called The Cove. That's what they're calling this multiplex. And that would be good for a first-time director. But nope, it's an M. Night Shyamalan movie. And he moves someone in Cleveland's multiplex. And he gets introduced to Harry Farber, played by Bob Balaban, who I reviewed a couple of times in these two particular movies, for example. But here, like Giamatti, he's completely wasted as a very unlikable character. Cleveland suffers a speech impairment, and why should I care? I honestly don't know. And I don't really care, despite I like Paul Giamatti at times, but the problem I'm having is he's not caring enough as a character, in my opinion. Cleveland sees someone in the water and tries to get her out of the pool because it's not safe at this time at night when it's dark. And apparently he can't swim, or I think he can later in the movie because he can go swimming underneath where she was from. But in the meantime, in another world, helps him, someone from another world, it's a woman by the way, and to his apartment and wakes up finding Story, and that's her name, believe it or not. Played by Bryce Dallas Howard from last week's movie. And I've said my fair share with Bryce Dallas Howard, if you can believe it. And they're introduced to each other, and Cleveland goes outside for some fresh air and sees what appears to be a wolf and scares the crap out of both Cleveland and Story, and he reports it to the authorities. And I have a question. Why can't Cleveland... Well, he could swim later on, so that's not going to matter. And why is M. Night so stupid to show the wolf, but not have a good vision of the thing? And throughout this damn movie, and this is again a mess, and then we realize this is all from a bedtime story. And honestly, this is the worst bedtime story I've ever seen, or shockingly enough, and actually, to tell you the truth, this is an original story from M. Night Shyamalan that he tells to his daughters. Why would you tell her something creepy like that? This movie's pace is really slow. I kept looking at the time, like, how long have I been watching this thing? And there's no setup. It's just going straight into the bedtime story, and without any setup whatsoever is a little obnoxious in my opinion, because don't we need a setup to like these characters? Next thing you know, we get introduced to a cross-word puzzle gentleman named genius named Mr. Dury, played by Jeffrey Wright, who I'll eventually get to know him and review him again when I do these movies. And I've always enjoyed him as an actor, to be fair. But this is not a good performance from Mr. Wright, in my personal opinion. We get another character who's a writer of stories named Vic Ron, played by the movie's director, M. Night Shyamalan. And he had to get a part in this movie, so why not? Who's writing a cookbook. And his character may be the strongest character in this movie, which is not ruinous. But I don't care for these characters in general. So that kind of tells you something. We find out from Storia that Cleveland was married and a doctor, and ever since his wife's death, she claims he has no purpose in this world except for he's a handyman at the Cove. And this scene I barely like because we find out a little bit more about Cleveland, and I was barely liking that moment in the film. Story gets attacked by the wolf and goes to the stairwell, and Cleveland finds her, and suddenly the wolf attacks them out of the blue. And that was a pretty good jump scare, honestly. And I have to confess this now. When I saw this in theaters, I remember, like I told you before, I sat next to two women that screamed out loud in the theater twice. This was one of them. And that was one of them, and that made me laugh so hard after I jumped and heard them screaming. But at the same time, I was like, Jesus Christ. But I will confess, this has some pretty good jump scares at times. Not always, but times. Cleveland asks around the building about the bedtime story and gets some ideas of the story of turns out how from story in this is turning out like The Village, where it's getting boring. And I'm not accepting it like The Village, I'm sorry. And Cleveland's story tries to stare at hypnotize at the wolf, but he can't get hypnotized by Cleveland. And the next thing you know, Cleveland runs into Mr. Farber, and that was rather too M. Night cliche, and that didn't make me scared one little bit. But it was loud, though. Cleveland says he can't protect her, and I thought, this is taking way too long. It's about 10 minutes too long. Like, I was checking how much there's there left. It's like I said at the beginning, it's way too slow. Cleveland throws a party to save a story's life in the multiplex, and looks like a fun party, I'll give it that. And hopefully it scares the wolf away. But the wolf grabs Story, which didn't work out very well, and the plan doesn't work, and Story's hair is suddenly blonde. Like, out of the blue? Really? And that was rather weird. They get all the helpers to help Story, and the second jump scare from those two ladies I sat next to at the movie theaters, and myself, the wolf gets inside the stairway, but it was only that moment when the wolf just comes into the stairway, but kills Mr. Farber, which good riddance, because he was the worst character in this entire movie, and his death was cliched to death, as he talks about what to do in a horror movie, and that was stupid. Mr. Dury's son Joey tells the vision of the story of what will happen was again terrible. Cleveland gets a lady with 5 daughters together, maybe 7. I couldn't really pay attention to that. I was checked out at that point. With her 5 daughters, and the band starts playing, and it starts to rain. Which, how convenient. Just like Joey reading the story wrong, and a man has to stop the wolf, Cleveland may be the healer, but he can't protect her in any way. And I thought, really with that? Then the wolf attacks for the last time, and we find out someone named Benji is the savior. And I thought to myself, we barely knew who this guy was. And now he's the savior? And apes come down and take the wolf away? And the eagle takes Story to her home, wherever that is? And I thought, whatever. How retarded is this movie anyways? Let's give it the rating right now. I'll give this movie a 3.7 out of 10. There's a few things I liked here, like the 2 jump scares and the opening drawings was pretty neat, but The Village is kind of better than this. And these characters are just as weak as in The Village. I also like we barely knew Cleveland as a character, but I'm afraid it's not enough for me to like this movie. And one more thing. This is the weakest bedtime story I've ever heard from M. Night Shyamalan. or any bedtime story for that matter. So I'd like to thank you guys for joining me, and next week I will be back with The Happening. And until next time, tell your girls to go to bed, M. Night.